My name is Lena Moore, 31 years old, and in my family, I have always been the one standing outside the light. I once thought that was just my own feeling until the day everything collapsed. If you were betrayed by your own family like that, what would you do? Leave a comment now before continuing this story. The day my grandfather Henry had to move into a nursing home was the day I clearly understood my true position in the family. My mother called early in the morning and said in a flat voice that he was weak and needed to complete the admission procedures. She asked if I could arrange my time, but the way she asked sounded like she already had the answer. I took 3 days off work at the library to handle his paperwork. Meanwhile, my brother Brian was busy with an important project, according to my mother. A project I later learned was going to look at a new house with his fiancée. My family has always divided things very clearly. Heavy and silent work belongs to me, while bright and proud things always belong to Brian. It happened so naturally that no one felt the need to explain it. That evening we ate dinner together. My mother set the table very quickly, as if she had more important things than this meal. My father ate while looking at his phone. Brian talked about the new watch he had bought and laughed comfortably. He said that everything ahead would be fine, and my parents' eyes lit up with every word he spoke. I asked what fine meant, and the question made the kitchen fall silent for a few seconds. My mother smiled lightly and said that selling my grandfather's farm would solve everything. The sentence was spoken as gently as if she were talking about an old, unused object. I repeated the words, "sell the farm," and felt my throat go dry. My father put down his chopsticks and sighed, and said that he was old and keeping land was a waste. Selling it to help Brian buy a house was the most reasonable thing because the whole family would benefit. No one asked what I thought, and no one asked whether my grandfather knew. That farm was the place my grandfather built after the war with his own hands. The place where I grew up among wheat fields and windy afternoons. The place where he taught me to draw my first houses with a pencil on old newspapers. But in that dark kitchen, it became only an asset that could be turned into money. I asked whether he knew about this, and my mother answered very quickly that he was old and telling him would only make him worry. Brian shrugged and told me not to be too sensitive because the land still belonged to the family. I stayed silent and finished the meal with a choking feeling that no one noticed. 2 days later, I went to the nursing home. My grandfather lay on the bed much thinner, but his eyes were still bright, and when he saw me, he smiled gently. He called me his little librarian and asked if I was tired. I helped him drink water and adjust his pillow and tried to talk about light things. The question about the farm was stuck in my throat because I was afraid of making him sad and afraid of becoming the bearer of bad news. Before I left, he held my hand very tightly and told me to go to the farm and take the wooden box in the drawer of his desk. I asked why he did not tell my parents to get it, and he looked at me for a long time and said that only you understand it. That sentence made me feel cold because for the first time, I sensed that he saw through something I had not dared to face. The next afternoon, I drove to the farm. The gate was still open and the fields still stretched before my eyes, but there was a sign planted by the fence that said "sold" and showed the phone number of a land development company. I stood there for a long time in the wind and the familiar smell of dry grass. Everything looked the same, but I knew on paper it no longer belonged to him. I called my mother to ask about it, and she was silent for a few seconds, then said not to make a big deal because everything had been arranged. I asked arranged by whom, and she answered by the adults, and that I only needed to take good care of my grandfather. Her voice sounded annoyed, as if I had overstepped my authority. That evening, I returned to my parents' house. Brian was trying on a suit in front of the mirror while my parents discussed organizing a party for their 25th wedding anniversary. They said it had to be big, so people could see how happy the family was. No one mentioned my grandfather, and no one mentioned the farm anymore, as if neither had ever existed. I stood in the living room and realized that my family was not only selling a piece of land, they were selling memories and promises. And I was the only one standing between my grandfather and that truth, pushed into a position no one asked whether I wanted or not. When I left the house that night, I knew clearly that if I stayed silent, I would become an accomplice, and if I spoke up, I would become a traitor in their eyes, and that choice would decide the rest of this story. My grandfather's farm was not just a piece of land, but for me it was an entire childhood world. Every summer I was sent to live with him, and every morning I woke up, hearing the wind blow through the wheat fields, and the sound of the old wooden door creaking as he stepped onto the porch. He always woke up very early and poured me a warm glass of milk. then placed in front of me an old newspaper and a pencil worn down at the tip so I could draw the houses I imagined. He said that people spend their whole lives only hoping to have a place to return to, and this farm was such a place. I remember clearly every small path between the rows of plants, every old well where he taught me how to draw water without spilling it. Every afternoon we sat on the steps watching the sun set, and he told me how he built this farm after the war. He said that back then he had nothing but his 2 hands and a promise to my grandmother that he would build a house strong enough to shelter the family from wind and rain. To me, the farm was not property but living memory, the only place where I ever felt that I truly belonged. When I was 14, my grandmother passed away, and from then on he lived alone in that large house. I was often the only one who visited him regularly, and he began to talk to me more about the future of that land. One very quiet afternoon, he sat by the window and said that only the person who understood the value of this place deserved to keep it. Then he looked at me for a long time and said that one day this farm would be yours. At that time, I laughed and thought it was just a joke from an old man who loved his grandchild. But in the years that followed, he repeated that sentence many times, and each time more seriously. He told me that people can lose money but must never lose their roots, and that the farm was the root of this family. When he entered the nursing home, I realized that the memory of those words suddenly became heavy, because what my family was doing was completely opposite to what he had believed. In the hospital room, he was not confused, as my mother said. He remembered every old story clearly and asked me about my work at the library, asked if I still drew houses and if I still kept the notebook he had given me long ago. I looked into his eyes and saw no blur of old age but only quiet observation and understanding. Before I left that day, he held my hand and mentioned again the wooden box in the drawer of his desk at the farm. He said it was something he had kept for a long time and only now needed to take out. I asked what was inside, and he only smiled and said that you will understand when you see it. I began to realize that he was not naive about what was happening in the family. Perhaps he had seen the change in his son long ago, but chose to stay silent to watch who would truly stand by his side. On the way home, I thought a lot about the years with him and about the promise I once took lightly. I wondered whether he knew the farm was being sold, and if he did, then why he said nothing. That question kept me awake all night. The next morning, I returned to the nursing home and sat beside his bed for a long time. I did not dare mention the sale of the land, but I asked if he worried about the farm, and he looked out the window and said that people only truly worry when they have prepared nothing for the future, and that he had already prepared. That sentence made my heart beat faster because I understood that he was hinting at something I did not yet know. When I stood up to leave, he held my hand again and placed into it an old key worn with age. He said that this key opened the drawer in his office, and that I must keep it carefully because it did not only open a box, but also opened the truth. I held the key, and for the first time felt that my grandfather had foreseen everything and was quietly preparing another path. Not for the family, but for me alone. From that moment, the memory of the promise when I was 14 was no longer something of the past, but became something waiting for me to face. And I understood that my next trip to the farm would not only be to take a wooden box, but to uncover the secret he had kept for many years. I returned to the farm on a windy afternoon with the old key in my pocket and an uneasiness of unknown origin. The dirt road leading to the house was still familiar, but the sold sign planted in front of the fence made everything feel strange. I walked slowly, step by step, as if moving any faster would cause my childhood memories to shatter under my feet. I opened the wooden house door, and the smell of dust and old wood filled my nose. Everything was still in the same place as many years before, but I knew something had been taken without asking his permission. In the study, I pulled open the desk drawer and saw the small wooden box placed neatly as if waiting for me. But instead of opening it right away, I stood there for a long time and looked around the room where he once drew designs and told me about houses that were never built. Outside, I heard a car stop, and 2 strangers wearing land survey company uniforms walked along the fence. They talked about a new residential project, and I heard every word clearly, like a declaration that this place no longer belonged to my memories. I left the farm in an empty state and drove straight to my parents' house. On the way, I thought about all the questions I had to ask, and the answers I was afraid to hear. When I entered the living room, Brian was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie and smiling with satisfaction at his image. My parents were sitting on the sofa, discussing the menu for the upcoming anniversary party, as if the whole world revolved around that day. I asked directly who had signed the papers to sell the farm, and the room suddenly fell silent for a few seconds. My father looked at me with annoyance and said that adult matters should be handled by adults. My mother added that they had done what was best for the family and that I should not interfere. I said that my grandfather had never agreed to sell and that I had just seen the sold sign at the gate. Brian laughed and said that I was being too dramatic because the land would eventually belong to someone else anyway, so selling it early meant getting a better price. He boasted that his new house was bought with that money and that he was about to hold a big engagement ceremony to start a new life. I looked at him and realized that in his eyes the farm was only a stepping stone for him to move forward and not a place that held the past of the whole family. I turned to my mother and asked why she did not tell my grandfather, and she frowned and said that he was old and weak, and if he knew he would be shocked and become more ill. She told me that if I truly cared about him, I should stay silent and not make things complicated. My father added that they had sacrificed a lot for this family, and selling that piece of land was only a reasonable decision to help their son have a future. He asked why I always stood on my grandfather's side instead of standing with my parents. I realized that in that question I had been placed outside the family without knowing when it happened. I said that I only wanted to know the truth and wanted him to be respected, but Brian interrupted and told me not to play the hero because I was not the one who made money for this family. That sentence made the atmosphere in the room heavy, and I understood that they not only wanted me to be silent, but also wanted me to accept my role as before, as the one who stood behind and had no right to decide. My mother stepped forward and said that if I talked about this with my grandfather and caused him to collapse, then I would have to take responsibility. She looked at me as if I were threatening the stability of the whole family just because of a piece of land. I felt pushed into a corner with no way out. One side was my grandfather and childhood memories. The other side was my parents and brother with reasons wrapped in the words for the family. I left the house in heavy silence and no one walked me to the door. On the steps, I paused for a few seconds and heard them continue talking about the party as if the conversation had never happened. On the way home, I thought about the wooden box still lying in his study and about his words that only I understood it. I began to realize that the truth was being hidden not only to protect him but to protect those who had betrayed his trust. That night I could not sleep, and in my mind appeared the image of the sold sign in front of the farm, and Brian's proud smile when he showed off his new house. I realized that my family had gone too far to turn back, and that I was standing at a point where every silence became complicity. When dawn approached, I knew that I could not continue pretending I had seen nothing, and that my next step would not only be a conversation, but a choice between protecting the truth or continuing to be a shadow in my own family. That night, I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling in the dark for a long time. In my mind, the image of the sold sign at the farm gate and my parents' calm faces saying everything had been arranged kept repeating. I understood that if I continued to be silent, I would become part of that deception. But if I spoke out, the first person to be hurt would be my grandfather, the man who had spent his whole life building that land with his own hands. I asked myself whether I had enough courage to break his fragile peace. I was afraid to see the disappointment in his eyes when he learned that his own son had secretly sold the place he considered the soul of the family. For many hours I struggled between two opposite thoughts. One side was the truth. The other side was the false calm my family was trying to keep. I remembered the afternoons sitting on the porch with him and hearing him say that silence never saves anyone, but only allows wrongdoing to grow over time. Back then I thought it was just a general lesson, but now those words echoed in my mind like a reminder I could not avoid. I understood that if I did not speak, then no one would, and if I accepted silence, I would betray what he had taught me about honesty. The next morning I went to the nursing home earlier than usual. On the way my legs felt heavy as if each step carried a difficult decision. When I entered his room, I saw him sitting and looking out the window with sunlight shining on his thin but alert face. I sat beside his bed and held his hand. In the first few minutes I said nothing because I did not know how to begin. My heart was beating fast and my throat felt dry. Finally I said that I needed to tell him something important, and asked him not to be angry because I did not want to hide it from him anymore. He turned to look at me for a long time and then nodded as if he had been waiting for this moment. I told him about the sold sign at the farm, about the conversation with my parents, and about Brian using that money to buy a new house. I tried to keep my voice calm, but inside I trembled in waves because I feared his reaction. When I finished, the room was so silent that I could clearly hear the wall clock ticking. I did not dare look straight into his eyes because I feared seeing the collapse I had imagined all night. But when I looked up, I did not see anger or pain as I expected. He only sighed lightly and held my hand tighter. He said that he had known this would happen long ago because he had seen the change in his son year by year, and he was no longer naive enough to believe that family bonds could protect a piece of land when greed had grown. He said that he was not shocked by the truth but only sad that it came sooner than he thought. And he said that what he cared about most was not the land but whether someone had enough courage to stand on the side of the truth. I burst into tears and apologized for not telling him sooner. He shook his head and said that I was not at fault because he himself had chosen to stay silent to observe who in this family still remembered the true value of the farm. Then he asked me to take out the key and asked whether I had gone to his study. I said that I had seen the wooden box but had not opened it. He nodded and said that inside were things I needed to know but not yet. He said that the truth should not be spoken in a small room but in a place where no one could deny it, and he mentioned my parents' upcoming wedding anniversary party as if it had already been part of his plan. I looked at him in surprise and asked what he intended to do, and he only said that I did not need to worry. I only needed to be there and listen. The rest had already been prepared by someone else. He took his phone and called someone I did not know. He said briefly that it was time and that the party would take place as scheduled. After hanging up, he looked at me and said that I had done the right thing by choosing to tell the truth, and from now on, I would no longer have to carry this burden alone. On the way home, I felt both lighter and heavier, lighter because I no longer had to hide it from my grandfather, and heavier because I knew what was about to happen would shake my entire family. I understood that the moment I walked into his room and spoke, the truth was the moment I stepped onto another path. A path where I was no longer the shadow behind my brother but the one who had to face the consequences of the truth directly. When the car stopped in front of my house, I looked up at the darkening sky and knew that the upcoming party would not only be a wedding anniversary celebration but the place where every secret would be brought into the light. And from this moment on, I could no longer return to being the silent one as before. I returned to the nursing home the next morning with a heavy heart as if carrying a secret too large for my body. My grandfather Henry was already sitting by the window waiting for me as if he knew for certain that I would come back. He gestured for me to pull a chair closer and said that it was time for me to hear the truth about the farm and about my family. Before I could ask, he took from the drawer an old brown envelope with a postmark from many years ago. Inside was a carefully clipped stack of papers and a business card of a man named Samuel Brooks, his personal lawyer. He said Samuel would come to see me that afternoon and that I needed to hear everything from him so I would no longer be led by the nose. I sat there with my heart pounding because I sensed that what I was about to learn would change completely the way I saw my parents. That afternoon, I met Samuel in the small common room of the nursing home. He was a man about 60 years old with a calm voice and very sharp eyes. He greeted me as if he had known me for a long time, and said that my grandfather had prepared for this situation for many years. Samuel opened his briefcase and took out a copy of the farm ownership documents. On them was clearly written the name of my grandfather Henry, and not the names of my father or mother, as I had believed since childhood. Samuel explained that the farm had never been legally transferred to my parents, but was only temporarily entrusted to them under the condition that it could not be sold or mortgaged. I felt as if my mind had been doused with cold water, because for so many years the whole family had been living in a lie, and I was the last one to know. Samuel also said that my grandfather had set up a trust fund 5 years earlier to protect this property, and that Samuel himself was appointed as the supervisor, while the final beneficiary was me. I could hardly speak because I had never imagined that I would be the one my grandfather trusted so much. Samuel looked at me and said that my grandfather had observed how my parents treated me for many years, and knew that if he did not prepare in advance, everything would be taken away, and no one would protect me. I asked why he did not tell me earlier, and Samuel replied that my grandfather wanted to be sure that I was strong enough to stand up and face my family instead of just avoiding them as before. When I returned to my grandfather Henry's room, he was resting with his eyes closed, but when he heard my footsteps, he opened his eyes and smiled gently. I said that I had met the lawyer and already knew everything. He held my hand and said that he did not want to leave this world while leaving behind a granddaughter who was looked down on and left with nothing. He said that he had been wrong to stay silent for too long. and let my parents believe that they had the right to everything that belonged to him. I felt my throat tighten, because for the first time in my life, someone in the family said that I deserved to be protected. He told me that the upcoming family meeting would be very important and that I did not need to argue or shout, but only needed to let the truth speak for itself. He had asked Samuel to prepare all the documents to announce in front of everyone. I left the nursing home that evening with a strange feeling of fear and calm at the same time, as if I was walking into a storm, but this time, I was not empty-handed. I went home, and for the first time in many weeks I could sleep without feeling my heart weighed down because I knew that what my parents had done could no longer be hidden. I was no longer the daughter who only bowed her head in silence, but the one holding the biggest truth of the family. And in my mind echoed only one sentence from my grandfather, that sometimes silence is not kindness, but betrayal of oneself. The family meeting was held on Sunday afternoon in the large living room of the farm, where it had previously only been used for birthday parties and fake gatherings. This time there were no cakes or decorations, only a heavy atmosphere covering every chair. My parents sat in the middle of the room with irritated faces because they believed my grandfather was making too much of everything. My brother Mark sat next to them with an indifferent attitude, as if this had nothing to do with him. I entered last together with Samuel, and immediately felt all eyes turned toward me. My mother frowned and asked why I brought an outsider into a family matter. Samuel calmly introduced himself as my grandfather, Henry, personal lawyer, and said he was authorized to announce some important information. My father sneered and said that this was just a play by an old man who was about to die and a daughter who wanted attention. I felt my hand tremble slightly, but still sat down next to my grandfather. Samuel opened his leather briefcase and took out a thick file. He said that the purpose of today's meeting was to clarify the ownership of the farm and the money that had just been obtained from its sale. As soon as he finished, Mark laughed and said that everyone knew the farm belonged to my parents because they had lived there for more than 10 years. Samuel did not argue, but placed a copy of the document on the table and asked everyone to look at the name on it. It was not my father's name and not my mother's name, but my grandfather Henry's name. The room fell completely silent for a few seconds, before my mother stood up and said that it was fake, and that my grandfather had promised them the farm long ago. Samuel calmly explained the difference between a promise and a legal transfer, and said that there was no document proving my parents' ownership. My father began to lose control and pointed at me, saying that I had incited my grandfather to do this out of jealousy toward my brother. Mark also turned to me with angry eyes and said that I always wanted to destroy the family because I was never favored. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in my life, did not lower my head but looked straight at them. I said that I did not sell the farm and did not take anyone money, and that it was they who had done so without my grandfather's consent. Samuel continued to read the trust terms and clearly stated that the final beneficiary was me and that my grandfather had signed them many years earlier while fully lucid. My mother cried and said that my grandfather had been manipulated by me when he was mentally weak. Only then did my grandfather speak. His voice was weak but very clear. He said that no one had manipulated him and that he was simply too tired of seeing his daughter and son-in-law treat his property as their own. He said that for many years he had observed how they treated me, and understood that if he did nothing, I would be pushed aside with empty hands. Mark slammed his hand on the table and said that my grandfather favored me because I was the grandchild who stayed with him the most. My grandfather replied that caring was not favoritism, but what people should give to one another. Samuel announced that according to the law, the recent sale of the farm was invalid, and that the money must be returned within the legal time limit, or they would be sued. My father turned pale, and my mother collapsed back into her chair as if she had no strength left. I looked at them and felt no longer the familiar fear but a cold emptiness inside. The meeting ended in heavy silence. No one stood up to congratulate or say another word. Mark walked out, first slamming the door. My parents stayed but did not look at me. Samuel gathered his papers and said that he would contact us again to guide the next steps. When everyone had left, I stayed sitting with my grandfather in the empty room. He held my hand and said that everything would be difficult, but I was no longer alone. I nodded, but understood in my heart that from this moment my family would never be the same, and that the real storm had only just begun. The days after the family meeting passed like a long chain of silence and tension as every room in the house seemed to hold arguments that had not yet been spoken. My phone kept vibrating with messages and calls from relatives who mostly did not ask if I was okay, but tried to find out how much of the truth there was and who was to blame. Some blamed me for making things too big and causing the whole family to lose face. Others whispered that my parents had gone too far and now had to pay the price. I listened to everything in exhaustion and no longer had the strength to explain because I understood that everyone only believed the story they wanted to believe. Mark cut off all contact. He blocked my number and avoided me whenever I entered the shared house. My parents also no longer looked at me as their daughter but as a traitor. Every shared meal became a heavy silence where even the sound of a spoon touching a bowl sounded like an accusation. I began to lose sleep because every night I thought about what had happened and wondered whether I should have stayed silent to preserve something called family. My grandfather was the only one who still spoke to me in a normal voice, but I could clearly see that he was also in pain, watching his daughter turn her back on him. Some afternoons I saw him sitting alone on the porch, looking toward the old fields that had once been the pride of the whole family, and his eyes no longer had the light they once did. Neighbors began to look at me with curiosity and caution whenever I went to the grocery store. Some asked me directly if it was true that my parents had taken my grandfather money. Others only looked silently and turned away as if I were a troublesome story. The feeling of being watched made me withdraw and no longer want to step outside the house. During those days, I realized that the truth does not always bring immediate relief, but sometimes it is like a storm that sweeps away everything familiar. I remembered the years when I tried to please my parents by staying silent and yielding so that Mark would always be the one who received praise. And now that I no longer did that, my place in the family disappeared instantly. One evening, I overheard a conversation between my parents and a relative in the living room when they said that I had been spoiled by my grandfather and that I no longer knew how to think for the family. Those words made me realize that in their eyes I had never truly been a part of it, but only someone dependent who had to obey. I began packing my belongings in my room as a reflex of self-defense, because I felt that I no longer had a place in the very house where I grew up. My grandfather saw me folding clothes and asked if I intended to leave, and when I nodded, he stayed silent for a long time, and then said that if staying here caused me pain, I should find another place to breathe. That sentence made me both sad and relieved because, finally, someone did not blame me for choosing to leave. I moved temporarily into a small room behind the house of an old friend, and every morning I returned to visit my grandfather to cook and help him take his medicine. That physical distance did not make things easier, but helped me see more clearly that I had lived too long in the role of the one who endured. During the days of living alone, I began to think about the future, instead of only thinking about family. I realized that I had never asked myself how I wanted to live my life, but only tried to keep everyone around me satisfied. An aunt called me and said that among the relatives, many people had begun to doubt my parents' actions, and that the truth was no longer as easy to hide as before. That news did not make me happy, but only made me tired because I understood that this battle was no longer within my control alone. I visited my grandfather on a rainy afternoon and saw him arranging old family photos, as if he wanted to preserve the days before there was conflict. He said that people often fear the truth because it forces them to change, and not everyone is brave enough to accept that. I sat beside him, and for the first time said that I was afraid of being left alone if everything went too far. He held my hand and said that loneliness for telling the truth was better than living a lifetime in lies. That sentence stayed in my mind for many nights. I understood that the isolation I was enduring was simply the price of no longer being someone else's shadow, and that this path, though painful, was the only path that allowed me to exist as myself. When I looked back at what had happened, I no longer saw myself as the one who broke the family, but as the first person who dared to speak what had been wrong for a very long time. And in the silence of those days of being turned away, I began to learn how to stand on my own, preparing myself for the final confrontation that I knew would be even more painful but would also be the turning point, so that I would never return to being the Lena of resignation again. The official working day with the lawyer took place in a bright white room that made me feel as if everything was exposed under merciless lights. My parents arrived early but sat completely to one side as if building an invisible wall between us. Mark appeared last, with a tired face and avoiding eyes. Samuel opened the file and began to explain each next step in a calm but firm voice. Every sentence he spoke was like a drumbeat, striking the heavy silence in the room. I looked down at my hands and realized they were no longer shaking like before, but only slightly cold because I knew this was the moment of no return. My father tried to maintain calm, but I clearly saw the irritation in the way he gripped his pen. My mother did not cry but stared at the floor as if trying to escape reality. When Samuel asked each person to confirm their position, no one spoke for several long seconds. Mark broke the silence by asking whether everything could stop here. That question made me understand that he did not truly care about right or wrong, but only feared losing the life he was used to. I looked at him and realized for the first time that I no longer felt small under his gaze. I said that it was not I who pushed things too far, but the silence of the whole family for many years that had brought us to this day. My mother burst into tears and said that I was choosing money instead of family. That sentence pierced my heart like a needle, because for so many years I had lived only to hold on to the word family. But this time I did not bow my head and replied that I was not choosing money, but choosing the right to be respected, and choosing not to continue being seen as someone who could be sacrificed at any time. Samuel confirmed that the decisions had been legally recorded, and from this point on, any continued dispute would have to follow the path of the law. The room became so quiet that I could clearly hear the air conditioner running steadily on the ceiling. When I stood up to sign the final papers, I felt as if I were placing a full stop on an old version of myself. Mark looked at me for a long time, and then said that he did not understand how I could go this far. I answered that perhaps because I had been used to enduring, so when I no longer endured, people felt it was too much. My mother turned her face away and said nothing more, while my father simply stood up and left the room before the meeting ended. The hallway outside was brighter than the meeting room, and when I stepped out, I felt as if I had just left a place that no longer belonged to me. Mark followed me a few steps and asked whether I regretted it. I stopped and said that the only thing I regretted was staying silent for too long and letting things reach this point. He did not answer, but only turned away like someone who could not find an answer for himself. I stood alone in front of the building and took a deep breath. In that moment, I realized that freedom does not come with complete joy, but comes together with a very real sense of loss. I had lost my family as it once was, but I had also found my own voice again. I thought of my grandfather waiting for me at home and knew that at least I was not completely alone. That evening I sat beside him and told him everything briefly. He only nodded and said that this path would not make me happy immediately but would help me no longer live in fear. I looked at his aged face and understood that today decision was not only for me but also for a generation that had been silent for too long. And when night fell, I knew that the old chapter of my life had closed, to open another chapter that, though unclear, was a chapter chosen by myself. A few months after everything ended, my grandfather and I moved to a small house near the sea where every morning we could hear the sound of waves and smell the salty wind through the window. Life here was so slow that I could hear time passing in every meal and every afternoon sitting beside him on the porch. My grandfather often told stories from his youth and said that he had never thought there would be a day when he had to leave the house where his daughter grew up. But sometimes leaving was the only way to keep memories from being hurt. Further, I started a new job at a small bookstore in town, and for the first time in my life, I felt that I did not need to prove anything to anyone. Every day I took care of my grandfather, watered the plants in the garden, and learned to paint in the evenings as a way to rediscover the dreams I had always set aside because of family. Sometimes I still received messages from relatives, but I no longer read them with fear or guilt, and only saw them as part of a past that was gradually fading away. I thought about my parents and Mark not with anger anymore, but with a quiet sadness because I understood that they too were people not brave enough to face their own mistakes. There were nights when I lay listening to the sea and wondered whether one day we could sit at the same table again as before, but then I realized that what mattered more was that I no longer had to live in silence to keep the peace. My grandfather often held my hand and said that he was proud that I chose the difficult path instead of the easy one. Those words did not erase all the pain, but helped me believe that my decision was not meaningless. I understood that family is not always a safe place, but people have the right to build another family for themselves from respect and love. If you are listening to this story and have ever felt overlooked in your own home, remember that you are not wrong for wanting to be heard and to live true to your values. Will you choose to remain silent or choose to stand up to protect yourself? Leave a comment to share your thoughts, because I truly want to know your story. And if Lena journey touched your emotions, do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can have more motivation to continue telling deeper and more truthful stories. Thank you for staying until the last line of this story, and I hope that when you close this video or page, you will feel a little stronger to continue on your own path.